So this very brief video aims to explain why Scotland's deficit is so much larger than the deficit of the rest of the UK and why that is not in fact a very surprising observation. The figures here are the GES figures for 2017-18, and they show how the deficit splits between the aggregate deficit from the rest of the UK, the deficit from Scotland, and therefore the total UK deficit of 39.3 billion, and how if you divide that by the population you get these deficit per capita figures. And we're looking to address three common comments or observations. The first is when people say, how come 8.2% of the population is responsible for 34% of the deficit? Because that is what these figures are showing. Or, to put it another way, how can Scotland's per capita deficit be more than 5 times that of the rest of the UK? Because that is what these two figures show. And finally, people say, well, if this is the case, surely it just shows how badly the Scottish economy performs under Westminster rule. So we're going to try and explain that. And to explain that, we're going to focus on these deficit per capita figures. And to understand this, let's first start by looking at this £428 deficit per capita that the rest of the UK incurs and understand how come Scotland's can be 5 times greater. So let's look at that £428 figure. It is arrived at by the rest of the UK generating an amount of revenue per capita and incurring an amount of expenditure per capita that leads to a deficit per capita of £428. Now hopefully you can immediately see that small percentage changes in revenue or expenditure per capita would lead to large percentage changes in deficit per capita. And so let's look at what happens in Scotland. Scotland raises an amount of revenue per capita, actually quite similar to the rest of the UK, but incurs higher expenditure per capita, which leads to £2,478 deficit per capita. So the deficit per capita is a lot larger. And of course, you can combine these two together to get the UK total figures. And that's the last figure, the £596 figure. So what's going on here? Well, Scotland is generating just 3% less revenue per capita than the rest of the UK. It's about £330 less per person revenue generated, but is incurring 14% more expenditure per capita, or £1,700 per person more expenditure per capita than the rest of the UK. And the net effect of that is the deficit gap, is that Scotland has a deficit that is £2,050 per capita more than the rest of the UK. So pause the video here if you want to digest these figures. But it allows us to answer those questions. So when people say, how can 8.2% of the population be responsible for 34% of the deficit? The answer is by that 8.2% of the population being responsible for 8% of revenue and 9.3% of spending. That's how. When people ask, how can Scotland's per capita deficit be more than 5 times that of the rest of the UK? The answer is because that's just the result of revenue per capita being 3% less and spending per capita being 14% more than the rest of the UK. And finally, to those who say, surely this just shows how badly the Scottish economy performs under Westminster rule, we say no, it shows how pooling and sharing allows higher expenditure per head in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and surely that is a good thing.